Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hi everyone, and welcome to the first official episode of the Therapy and Prayer podcast, formerly known as the Process Pod. My name is Camille, and I like to talk. If you haven't already, go back and listen to the last episode of the Process Pod. I talk a lot more about this transition that is happening and about how therapy and prayer came to be. And really, it feels like the end of an era. You know, the Process Pod was near and dear to my heart. It was a passion project that I started after years and years of thinking about it. And it was really helpful for me in my own personal growth. And I think it was helpful for those who were listening to it as well. But as my life is evolving and my ways of thinking are evolving as well, it just doesn't make sense to do anything without God in the middle of it anymore. That's just where I am in my life, y'all. That's where I am in my life. That's where I am in my spiritual walk and my spiritual journey. And so I'm going to be sharing that as well, in addition to continuing to talk about things related to mental health and wellness and processing all of those things. So I'm grateful for the Process Pod and for what it afforded me and for what it was for, I think, oh my goodness, how long was I even doing it? Maybe 2 years? Wow. Anyway, so I'm grateful for that. And even though I'm really just changing the name of it and I'm like changing how I'm doing it a little bit, it's still going to live in the same place. But I feel like, you know, with a new name, it's like we're giving it a fresh coat of paint. And it really, to me, feels like I'm starting a whole new show, a whole new podcast. I don't know exactly how different it's going to be. I don't know exactly what God is going to do with this new venture of mine, but I know that he's going to do something with it. And I know that he's here in the midst of it. So it's going to be a blessing one way or another. So thanks for being here. So since we are starting on a new journey here, and this might be your first time here, this might be your first time meeting me, I figured maybe let's, get to know each other a little bit. Just a couple of things about me, not too much, just a couple of things. I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I do mental health therapy and counseling. I've been doing that for several years now. I think going on 9 years now. I've been working in the mental health field doing therapy. And I am a lifelong Christian, born and raised in the church, and my relationship with God, my walk with him has really evolved over time, especially in the last couple of years. So I recently moved to Houston from California in June of 2023. And since that move, I've learned a whole lot. God has been showing me some things. I've been learning lots of lessons. The Process Pod was all about different lessons that I have been learning, or the people in my life have been learning, or folks that I've been working with. And so I still want to kind of talk about those things. A lot of what I'm talking about are either things that I am currently learning or things that God is currently showing me about myself, things that maybe I have already come through or that I've helped other people come through. So these are really practical lessons relating to faith and wellness that I've seen played out either in my life or in the lives of those that I know. But the last few months have been really taxing in several ways, like mentally, emotionally, spiritually taxing, and kind of draining. I've learned a whole lot about myself, and more importantly, a whole lot about God. So one of the first lessons that I learned shortly after moving here, y'all, God really had to sit me down shortly after I moved here. But one of the first lessons that I learned was about anxiety, control, and surrender. Now, I'm an anxious gal, okay? I have been anxious my whole life, but I finally was able to put language to it a few years ago when my therapist at the time was like, girl, all of what you're describing sounds very much like anxiety. I said, oh, you're not wrong. She wasn't wrong. But that has shown up for me in a few different ways. And kind of like related to that or tangential to that is my relationship with control. Now, it's wild. I never really would have considered myself a controlling person. I don't know very many people who would consider themselves controlling people. But we do all have a relationship with control. And mine has been closely tied to my anxiety, which is a very common thing. Anxiety and control are really similar. They're both rooted in fear. And that was what God had to show me, was that I was afraid. That was news to me, okay? Because I wasn't walking around shaking in my boots, and I wasn't verbally saying, I'm so afraid of this or I'm afraid of that. But what it really came down to was that I was afraid of relinquishing control. I was afraid of um, where God was going to take me next because I didn't know where he was going to take me next. And it's that fear of the unknown, which really is at the root of all anxiety, is the fear of the unknown. Now, let me tell you something. This lesson in my relationship with anxiety and control and surrender, I thought I had already learned it, but God said, no, girl, not quite. Not quite. Maybe I had only taken like the prerequisite, but I still had a few more levels to go. With a lot of lessons when it comes to faith and wellness too, it's like you think you learn it in one way, in one capacity, but you have not fully learned it. I don't know that we ever do fully learn these things because they show up in so many different ways in our life that we can't really predict. It's like when you're in school and you have to take algebra 1 before you can take algebra 2 before you can take calculus. Is that how it goes? I think it's a similar thing. Like I learned patience before in one way, and if I hadn't had learned it in that way, then it would have been impossible for me to learn it in the next way that God was going to teach it to me. I hope this is making sense. Anyway, that was kind of what it was with anxiety, control, and surrender. And I was like, dang, God, I thought we had already done this. Didn't. Didn't. We still had a long ways to go. Okay, so this is how God sat me down and showed me myself. So leading up to my move coming to Houston, I was very intentional with my planning and with my prayer and with making sure that God was at the center of it. I didn't want to do anything that was out of step or out of alignment with God's will for my life. I didn't want to be impulsive. I didn't want to be careless or thoughtless. And so I really felt like I had taken all of the necessary precautions to make sure that this move was something that God wanted for me. And in a lot of ways, I did that. I really took my time with it. I'd spent a lot of time in thoughts and prayer with God about it, considering different like possibilities and how it was going to happen and when it was going to happen and waiting on his timing and all of that. So intentional and feeling good about it the whole way. And the move itself was pretty seamless. And the move was confirmation. I think the way that the move happened and how comfortable I've felt here so very quickly and how easy I was to kind of adapt to living out here, all of that was really confirmation for me that this was where God wanted me to be. Now, why he wanted me to be here, that part maybe I'm still figuring out. But it's been clear to me that this was the right move for me. And I've been so grateful for that. But in that, not only was I planning the move, but I was planning what was going to happen soon after I moved. I was like, I'm going to get out there and then in a couple of months, I'm going to do this. And then maybe a few weeks after that, this is going to happen. And then this is going to happen. It was, it was wild. And so I get out here, right? And some things fell into place quickly, like my apartment, and I got my dog in the first couple of weeks. And like, it was a seamless transition with work. Like those things happened pretty quickly. So there was movement. And then all of a sudden there was no more movement. And then God put the brakes on and said, oop, all right, now hold on. You need to stay right here for a minute. I was anticipating and hoping for and planning and expecting a lot more movement in a few different ways. I was thinking about making some different transitions with work or maybe pivoting to something else. I was thinking about relationships and developing a sense of community and really making friends quickly. And I was really wanting a lot of things for myself. And there just was no movement. And when I say there's no movement, what I really mean by that is that was making, I was putting forth a concerted effort and being very mindful and intentional about trying to make certain things happen. Now that's the problem. That's where I messed up right there, is that I was trying to make things happen. And this is where the whole concept of surrender comes in, because I don't really have the authority of making things happen on my own, but I was kind of moving like I did. And so I was so frustrated and like it's not happening. Like the things that I'm wanting aren't happening. I'm not really um seeing any progress. And so what's going on, God? Like, I really thought that this is what it was supposed to be, but why isn't it happening? And because he gave me confirmation in one area, I took that to mean, all right, cool. Well, then everything else that I have in my mind is also must be being confirmed and affirmed in this as well. And that wasn't the case at all. So there was one night, um, I was finishing up a fast with my mom and my aunt, and that's a part of what I was praying for in the fast. And I just was kind of laying there having a moment with God, and He showed me some things about myself. And in that moment, um, He kind of led me to listen back to a voice note. I have voice notes in my phone. This is the way that I process. Like, okay, quick pause here. So the process pod really was born because I really do just sit and talk to like a camera or talk to a mic or talk to my phone. That's how I process. I need to think out loud with certain things. And so I have many voice notes in my phone. I don't often go back and listen to them, but sometimes I do. And this was one of those moments where something was telling me to just kind of go back and listen to what mindset I was in before my move. So I listened to a voice note that I did on my birthday. And my birthday's in March and I moved in June. So by March, I already knew that I was moving. Um, actually, no, did I already? Had I already come out here? No. Okay. So, um, my birthday's in March, and 2 weeks after my birthday, I already had a trip planned to Houston to visit my sister, and to also look at some apartments and to like really kind of start putting things into motion. So at that point, I already knew what I wanted to do. The plan was already developing. And in that voice note, I was talking about how excited I was and about how much I had been praying for this and how I'm I'm not going to get in the way. I'm doing this God's way. I'm doing this God's way. I was like so adamant. And I'm listening to it and I'm like, all right, cool. Yeah, cool. Good, good. But then in the voice note, I laid out so specifically a very clear timeline of how and when I wanted things to happen. Not even wanted, how and when I expected things to happen, how and when I was basically demanding things to happen. So now, listening back, right, I was in a different mindset as I was listening to that voice note than I was when I first recorded it. And as I was listening to it, I was like, girl, who do you think you are? You cannot tell God when He's going to move in your life. And essentially, that's what I was doing. And so when I moved out here, I still had that mindset that I was telling God when He was going to move in my life. I don't know who I thought I was. Okay. Got a little bit too big for my britches. God had to sit me down in that moment and show me how foolish I sounded. And I said, oh, you're correct, Lord, because this is a hot mess. And the reason that I even sat down to listen to that voice note and the reason that I was really fasting and praying so hard about all of this is because it was causing me so much anxiety. And what God had to show me was that I was causing myself all of this stress and anxiety because I was trying to force things to happen. That has been a pillar on my faith journey. Really paying attention to whether or not I'm trying to force things to happen or whether or not I'm allowing God to move in my life the way that He wants to move in the way that He deems necessary for me. So in that moment, the best advice that I've ever received came back to me. The best advice that I ever received was from my mom. And she said to me years ago, as a child of God, you don't have to force things to happen. As a child of God, you don't have to kick against the brick to make things happen and to make things move for you. And if you find yourself doing that, trying to force things to happen and kicking against the brick, then all you need to do is shift slightly one way or the other, and there's a clear path forward. And that has just always stuck with me. And so when I find myself getting overwhelmed and frustrated with stagnation, I have to really take a honest look and assessment at my life and how I'm moving and really determine, am I trying to force something to happen right now? And I had to really be honest with myself that yes, I was trying to force things to happen. Now, coming to that realization definitely put me in a different kind of state of mind and state of being. And I just really, in that moment, had to throw my hands up and decide, you know what? I'm going to stop trying to move anything forward right now. And I really had to do that. Now, part of what God was also showing me was that my transition, my move wasn't even complete yet. I hadn't even like decorated anything at all in my apartment. Like I was unpacked for the most part, but there was still some stuff that like, things weren't all the way together. I hadn't even completed this transition and I was trying to make all these other things happen, trying to initiate a bunch of other transitions as well. But girl, why would you do that to yourself? Knowing how anxious I am, knowing that I get overwhelmed, why would I do that to myself? So it really was my stress and anxiety that made me sit and turn back to God because I know that when something is for me, it comes with ease. and it comes with peace. That's not to say that everything is always easy in my life, but the way that I have seen God work in my life is that when something is for me, it happens kind of quickly and kind of seamlessly. And I don't have to put that much effort and energy into trying to make something happen. So the way that I interpret that is if I'm trying to make something happen, then there's a good chance that I'm walking outside of alignment of God's will for my life. And that's not nowhere I ever want to be, okay? I never want to be there. That's the sunken place. So once God showed me myself, then I had to make a conscious effort to look at Him instead. And this is where the control comes in my relationship with control. I had to accept the fact that God's will for my life at this moment was not the same as my will for my life. And I think that we all come to these moments where we have to make a decision about whose will are we going to prioritize. But even beyond that, if there's a choice to be made, then that alone tells me that I am not in alignment with God's will for my life, because I want my will to be God's will. I don't want to have to say, okay, my will or God's will. What I really want to do is say, why doesn't my will look like God's will? It shouldn't look that different, that I'm trying to go in a completely different direction than where He's trying to take me. Where is the disconnect here if that's what's happening in my life? And this is what true surrender is all about. Surrender is about acknowledging and relinquishing authority, acknowledging who has authority. It's about acknowledging God's authority and also acknowledging that I have none. I do not have the authority over my life and the things that happen in it that I thought that I had or that I wanted to have. We want to have that kind of authority because we feel like, as humans, we feel like if I have control, then I can predict the outcome and I can avoid a painful outcome. But that's just not true. That's not the way of the world. We cannot avoid every painful outcome. That's literally impossible. It's literally impossible. But also, the Bible tells us that we are going to have suffering and that we're going to have trials. That is one of the only guarantees that we have in life. But the reason that we try so hard to have control over every single part of our life is because we want to avoid a painful outcome. And I understand it. I understand it because I'm human too. No one likes to go through pain and suffering. Hello? Like we don't want to volunteer for that, to go through that. But somehow we got it misconstrued. And we forget the fact that struggle is guaranteed, regardless of who you are, regardless of how smart you are, regardless of how wealthy you are, regardless of how righteous you are, regardless of how holy you are. Pain is guaranteed for everyone. Now, I know that when we have experienced certain pain and certain trauma, like very extreme trauma and pain and suffering, that's always going to have an impact on the way that we see the world and the way that we navigate the world around us. But even in your darkest days, somehow you were able to be okay. God still was covering you and keeping you and protecting you, even in your darkest days, even in your painful trials. So even though there was pain, there was also God. And that's where the peace comes. The peace comes in knowing that God is going to get me through this like He's gotten me through everything else. And so I really had to remind myself of that in order to lean into a true surrender. Surrendering of my plan to God. Completely surrendering that plan and that authority to Him. Because what was happening is that I was trying to figure out God's plan before He was ready to reveal it to me. It's almost as if I was trying to give the final approval on God's plan for my life. Hello? That is so backwards. So backwards. That authority does not belong to me. And this is a lesson that I know I've learned before. I don't know when I forgot it or where I lost it, like where I lost the plot. But I, years ago, learned that I would gladly allow God to be in the driver's seat. I would gladly allow God to be the one making the big, hard decisions for my life because that way I don't have to do it. And my mantra for years now has been there is liberation in surrender. It's so freeing to acknowledge and accept the fact that I don't have to have all of the answers. It's impossible for me to have all the answers, so I'm not even gonna try. But I don't know what happened, y'all. Maybe the last couple of years have just been kind of chaotic, and maybe the last couple of years have I've just kind of been dysregulated, and so I was reaching for what was familiar, which maybe for me is a sense of control or trying to plan everything. Hmm. Maybe that's what it was because I know that I've learned this before, but I don't know. I think I was trying to take back some of that control, or I felt like as long as I was communicating with God about the plan, then that meant that we were on one accord about it. But that's not the case. As long as you tell God your plan, then he'll make it happen. Hello, where does that come from? The Bible don't say nothing about that. Not at all. So I really had to like check myself and put myself in my place. Well, God had to put me in my place and would just let me know, like, girl, you're actually not driving this car. You're actually not driving this car. Like, you're in the passenger seat, so relax because somebody who's way more equipped is driving the car. If I just have my learner's permit, but somebody who's actually driving has had their driver's license for 20 years, like, why wouldn't I trust them, you know? But trying to hold on to the steering wheel and trying to get God to reveal the plan to me before he was ready, like that was just causing so much anxiety in me. And everything else was feeling off. Like my mental was off, my emotional state was off, like my spiritual walk was off. I wasn't feeling as close with God because I felt like, God, why aren't you telling me? I kind of felt like he was leaving me in the dark. Like, why aren't you telling me what I'm supposed to be doing right now? Like, if okay, well, if I'm not supposed to be doing what I want to do, then tell me what I'm supposed to do. It was kind of like that. Like I was trying to buck at God, like, hello, what are we supposed to be doing then? You're not telling me nothing and you're not letting me do what I want to do either. So what are we doing? And it was just really causing a lot of stress within me. And I was worrying and I was becoming fearful. But I know that as a child of God, I'm not supposed to have a spirit of fear. And that worrying about things really leads to sin. And so here I am finding myself in this new place. I just moved out of state and I had prayed so much about this move and really felt like God was in the midst of it. And I know and have been affirmed that God brought me here and that this is where he wants me to be. But then he left me in the dark. And I just really had to come to grips with the fact that I was out of line. I was out of line. And when we're dealing with anxiety and control, one of the best things that we can do is acknowledge what is and is not in our control. We don't have control over the things that we want to have control over, which is other people and circumstances and all of the external things. We don't have control in all of the things that exist in the world around us, but we do have control over ourselves and how we choose to interact with the things around us. And that type of control is so much more impactful than we realize and than we acknowledge. But I really was trying to have authority over something that just did not belong to me. And God was trying to tell me, and I then had to tell myself, girl, put it down. What are you doing? What are you doing? It's like when you have a little kid who's all up in their parents' stuff and like they just don't know what to do with it. Just put it down. Just give it back to who it belongs to because you look foolish and you're about to hurt yourself. But the thing that I was trying to have authority over in this case was the timeline. And I just had to realize that God's timeline never belonged to me. And because God's timeline never belonged to me, I guess it also means that my timeline didn't really belong to me either. And so I had to find a way to merge those two and to really bring them back into one. Like somewhere along the line, I had become much more individualistic in my pursuit of God or in my pursuit of the things that I wanted. I think that's what it was. I stopped pursuing God and I started pursuing myself and the things that I wanted for myself. Dang, Camille. Mm. That's how controlling I was being, even in my relationship with God. How often do we let our desire or our need for control have control over us? Trying to have the level of control that we feel like we deserve and want and need. Oh my goodness, it causes so much pain and destruction and self-sabotage in our life. It's like you're letting the control you. For example, let's look at relationships. Let's talk about relationships. How often do we try to control other people that we're in relationships with? Whether that's by outright trying to tell them what to do or trying to manipulate the situation or showing up in a specific way to try to elicit a certain type of response out of them, or we feel like, if I just keep dropping hints and eventually they'll get it and eventually they'll do it. And really, we're trying to control the other person. And that leads to so much tension and resentment in a relationship. And eventually it just drives you apart, all because you couldn't step away from the control that never belonged to you, which is why it didn't work. It don't work when we try to do that, but we keep coming back to it and we keep trying to do it. I don't know how or why, but we find comfort in trying to control our environment. But girl, if you look at your history, when you've been trying to control things before, how has that worked out for you? Hmm? How has that worked out? Or has it just made things more difficult for you? But somehow that still feels safer than just surrendering to the fact that you're not in control of those things. But that's not to say that you're not in control of anything. So let's shift that a little bit. What are you in control over? You're in control over the expectations that you have of people. You're in control over the expectations that you have of yourself. You're in control of what you allow to be your guiding force and your kind of your compass in life, and the way that you navigate through life and the way that you make decisions. You're able to control the narrative that you believe about yourself and about the world around you. You're able to control the meaning that you ascribe to different things that are happening in your life. You're able to control whether or not something is quote unquote good or bad, or if it's just a neutral thing that happens. So we do have a lot of control. It's just not the control that we want. And I think it's a myth that if we were able to control the things that we want, then we would somehow be safer. I don't think that's true. In fact, the opposite is true. I'm much safer not being in control of those things because it's way safer if God is in control of them. That's the truth. But if you ask yourself that question and you're not able to feel that safety with knowing that God is in control, then we have to look a little bit deeper at why. And I think it comes down to the fact that we have experienced pain before. Control is all about fear and avoidance. We're trying to avoid a certain outcome. We're trying to avoid suffering. We're trying to avoid embarrassment, rejection, abandonment, failure. All of these things that we're afraid of, we're trying to avoid them. And for me, when I wasn't getting the things that I was like wanting and hoping, I don't think it was coming from a place of being stubborn and throwing a tantrum like, God, why don't you give me what I want? But in my mind, I had really good reason for chasing after some of these things. I was chasing after different professional opportunities because I thought that that would alleviate some of the financial strain and stress that I was feeling. But God has always provided for me before. Why? And He's still currently providing for me now. He never stopped. But somehow I was getting to this place of desperation, like I needed to do something. Otherwise, I wasn't going to have what I needed. And so it just kind of, to me, it kind of felt cruel that God was allowing me to experience the pain and stress that I was feeling from worrying about these things. But how crazy does that sound? It felt cruel that God was letting me worry about things. But God whole time has been telling me, don't worry about these things. And maybe the reason that He wasn't giving them to me was so that I could lean into that safety in Him instead of worrying about them on my own. Y'all, when God really showed me all these things about myself, I was like, sis, this is all so backwards. Like, what are we doing? Because I took it upon myself to try to relieve my own pain and suffering instead of just giving it to God. Girl, who do you think you are? So I had to just ask myself and answer honestly, like, do I or do I not trust God to protect me and to deliver me from any pain or suffering or trial that I may experience now or in the future? Do I or do I not trust Him to do that? And why wouldn't I trust Him to do that when He's always done it before? Essentially, do I trust Him enough to surrender? Do I trust Him enough to allow Him to be the only authority in my life? Because when I'm trying to do it, when I'm trying to be an authority, it just wasn't working. It just was not working. So do I trust God to be the authority in my life? Saying it now, that sounds like a silly question because hello, who else am I going to trust to be the authority in my life? But in honest reflection, I had to realize that I had moved away from that and that I was trying to be the captain of my own life and I was trying to be in the driver's seat. It wasn't conscious, and at the moment when these things were happening, I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. But I'm so grateful that God was able to work with me in that way and to really just reveal some things to me about myself. He really got to sit me down sometimes. And I'm always like, you know what? Let me pay attention as I'm moving and navigating through life so that God won't have to sit me down in these painful ways. It don't work. He's always going to have to get our attention, and he knows how to get your attention in ways that nobody else would. And I'm grateful for it, because who knows how many more things I would have been trying to force to happen in my life and how miserable that would have made me, because that's what it was doing. The dictionary definition of surrender is to cease resistance and submit to authority. And it was that resistance. And resistance is something that we face a lot in our growth and healing journeys, when we are healing from past traumas, and when we're maybe in therapy working on ourselves, and when we see new parts about ourselves, or when we're shown things about ourselves that maybe are unknown or that are challenging to accept, then we have this resistance to change. And in cases like this, we have a resistance to letting go of control, a resistance to surrender. So I realized that in theory, sure, I was surrendering to God, but in practice, it was like, kind of, not really, girl. And there was just a lot of reflection about why I wasn't letting go of the control. And surrender can feel really scary because of the unknown and because of the fear of the unknown. But if we really trust and believe that God is a loving God and that He's faithful, then that makes the unknown less scary. And in fact, it should give us comfort in knowing that He's already there. Where He's trying to take us, He's already there waiting for us. He's waiting for me to get in line with the program and to catch up so that I can get, He's already there waiting for me. So we have to rest in that. We have to rest in knowing that God is good and that God is faithful and that He's not going to lead us astray. We can lead ourselves astray, and if we try to have, if we allow the anxiety to motivate us and to control us and to dictate our steps and what we're doing, it's only going to get us further and further away from where we want to be. It's only going to invite more stress, anxiety, and depression. And it's just going to start this downward spiral that's so hard to get out of. There are only so many tools that we can use. We can use our coping skills and our deep breathing and all of that. But if at the root of it, you still have this fear and you're still trying to control everything, then the same patterns will keep showing up in your life over and over and over again. So the question about surrender becomes, can you trust someone else to interrupt this cycle and this pattern and to offer you peace instead? So it's been a process of me kind of realigning since then. But I mean, listen, to be honest, in that moment when God really sat me down that night, when I was just laying there and He's just showing me all these things, I was so grateful that He showed them to me so clearly, because it made it obvious to me where I needed to make some adjustments and where I needed to fall back and where I needed to just take my hands off of things and just rest in the stillness that God was keeping me in on purpose. I don't believe in coincidences. I don't believe in happenstance. God does everything in my life on purpose. So He has me here on purpose, and He has me being still on purpose. Some movement is happening in some areas on purpose, and movement is not happening in other areas on purpose. And I have to be equally grateful for both, because both of them are ordained by God and both of them are His doing. So that shift, that perspective shift and that reframe was really freeing for me and really liberating for me, because it allowed me just to rest in His promises, and it allowed me just to rest in the fact that God is in control, and I know that He's doing something even if I don't know what it is that He's doing. But I don't need to know what it is. I probably wouldn't even know what to do with the information if He gave it to me, which is why He's only giving me bits and pieces at a time when I'm ready for it and when I need to know it. And I had to ask Him to give me comfort, because at the same time, I still had all of the like tension that was existing in these different circumstances in my life that I was wanting to change. I was trying to run away from the challenges that they brought and the difficulty and the tension. And so I just really had to look to God for comfort and mercy and grace to help me to deal with some of the ongoing difficulties that I couldn't really do anything about, and that He was choosing to remain in my life. He was choosing to keep them in my life. And ultimately we all have to continuously recommit to our faith in God and our belief that He is who He says He is, and our belief that He is a good God and a loving God and a kind and gracious and merciful God who is always looking out for my good. If I believe that God is who he says he is, then I have to surrender to his authority in my life. It is much, much safer there, and he's much more equipped than I ever will be. So I want to share one of the scriptures that helped me when I was in that place, and that continues to help me now. It's become one of my favorite memory verses, and so that's kind of our scripture of the day. So our scripture of the day is from Lamentations chapter 3, verse 22 through 26. And it says, "The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I have hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. To the person who seeks him, it is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord." Y'all, that took me out when I read it. I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. And it was exactly what I needed. Because there were some moments where I was questioning, like, is God punishing me? Did I do something? Like, why would he have me here? But verse 22 says that the Lord's loving kindnesses never cease and his compassions never fail. God doesn't work that way. He's not punishing me for things. Whatever is or is not happening is an act of his loving kindness, and I have to believe that and trust that. His compassions never fail. He's always gracious and he's always merciful. That didn't change just because I'm in an uncomfortable circumstance. God has not changed who he is just because I'm going through something difficult. So I had to accept the fact that like multiple things are true, right? I was in an unknown season, and God's word is still true. Just because I'm in an unknown and unfamiliar territory, that does not negate the fact that God's word is true and that God is still the same God that he has always been, the same good, loving, kind, and merciful God that he has always been. And the comfort that I found from this verse specifically, but just from God's word, really allowed me to fully surrender to him. Verse, what is it? I mean, the rest of this passage, right? It says, "The Lord is my portion, therefore I have hope in him." That was my reminder that God is enough. He is my portion. He is really all that I need to be able to move through this life successfully, whatever success might look like. We also sometimes have to redefine success. Is it based on my terms or based on what God deems to be a successful and righteous life? And the word says that it is good to wait on him and to wait silently and to actively seek him and to silently wait. And I had to really meditate on, what does that mean? How do you actively wait and be silent and be still at the same time? But that's what we have to do. That's what God wants us to do so that he can work. And the way I look at it is, girl, go ahead and be still and be quiet so that you don't get in the way. I'm getting in the way. I'm trying to I'm trying to project my wants, but at the same time projecting my fears onto whatever God might be doing in my life, which is making it harder for me to remain faithful and obedient because I'm moving off of my anxiety and my fear. And that's pulling me in one direction that's not in the direction where God is. So it's been a process, and God is still showing me some things, but true surrender has given me so much peace. And even though it's not the easiest thing to do, it is so, so worth it. Okay, so I'm introducing a new part of the show, which is a question and answer. I've always wanted to do something like this. I want to create a space where we can dialogue and where I can speak kind of directly to what it is that some of you all might be experiencing and going through. So we have a question from a listener today, and the question says, "What are some healthy ways to deal with things constantly not going my way without getting overwhelmed?" That is so appropriate for all of what we are talking about. I think that the first thing to recognize is the my way part of it. And this is what I was talking about earlier, which is our will aligned with God's will. If everything is not going my way, then that's a clue that maybe I might be going in the wrong way. But it's difficult and it does get overwhelming because we want to be responsible. We want to be on top of things, like, especially in today, we live in the hustle culture and like the entrepreneurship culture and the get it for yourself and go get it and go do it and don't let anyone stop you. And like we're inundated with that all the time. And so I think it's natural that we might kind of buy into the myth that we can do whatever we want, and that things should always go our way and that things can always go our way. So from a spiritual standpoint. I think it's about making sure that your will is always in alignment with God's. If nothing is going your way, then which way are you going? That's the time to stop back and analyze and kind of reassess. Am I going where God is leading me, or am I trying to lead God? I think that's one of the main things when it comes to that frustration about things not going your way. We may not be in alignment with where we're supposed to be. What place are you making decisions from? Are you trying to make things happen from a place of fear, from a place of love? Like, what is that motivating factor for you? And is that motivating factor led by the spirit or led by your fear and by your anxiety? And then on the other side of that, it's also what I was talking about earlier with just acknowledging what is and is not in your control. We cannot control everything around us. We cannot control every part of our life. We just can't. That is a universal truth in the world. Whether you believe in God or if you believe in some other higher being or whatever it might be, we just don't have the amount of control that we would want to have. That's it. So so my other advice would be to take a step back and reevaluate the things that actually are in your control versus the things that you're trying to have in your control. A part of why things aren't going our way is because we're trying to maneuver and manipulate other people, other circumstances, specific outcomes. That's just that's just not a real thing. We just don't have that authority, right? And so if you can find a way to reframe your relationship with control and with your world around you, um, then I think it will become a whole lot easier to uh, be adaptable to what is or is not happening in your life. And that's the real major key is being adaptable because baby, life is so unpredictable, so unpredictable. And our efforts at trying to control everything is because we're looking for that predictability. We find safety in it. So you have to ask yourself, like, where do I truly find safety? Why do things have to go my way? What's what's wrong if they don't go my way? So we have to do some of that real self-reflection, and take a lot of those things to God and really give those expectations to him. But in your personal reflection, be honest with yourself about your motivation for wanting certain things, and about where you see uh, the control showing up. What is it inviting into your life? Is it inviting more anxiety? Is it inviting depression? And would you be willing to let go of that control if it also means that you get to let go of some of that anxiety and some of that depression? So if you're feeling overwhelmed because things are not going your way, then let's take a step back and number one, acknowledge that nobody ever has things always go their way. That is not a realistic expectation of this world and of this life at all. Things don't always go anyone's way, right? So that's the first thing is that nothing is always going to go your way. The second thing is to acknowledge that if things are not going your way, could that be God protecting or providing for you in another way that you're not paying attention to because you're so hyper focused on getting the things that you want? And then the third is taking a look back and reassessing what you do and don't have control over, really taking ownership over those things that do belong to you and surrendering the things that don't. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you so much for the question. If you have a question that you would like answered on the show, I would love to hear it. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at wellnesswith_Cam. Thank y'all so much for listening. I pray that it will be a blessing to you all as it has already been a blessing to me. God bless, take care, and I'll see y'all next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.